Welcome back to the Anchored Podcast. This is Noah Tyler introducing the Right Honorable Sir Nick Gibb. He was the school's minister in the nation of Britain and did an amazing job taking the nation that had fallen from 7th place in PISA standings down to 27th, getting them back on track. This conversation with Jeremy Tate will tell the story of how he came to understand phonics, understand the power of direct instruction and multiplication tables. It was about 13 years it took him to make this change. He had to work with a bureaucracy of 4,000 people with teachers' unions that are as entrenched as they are here in the States. And the story is gripping, and I can't wait for you to hear this episode with the Right Honorable Sir Nick Gibb.
Folks, welcome to the Anchor Podcast. We have a special guest today. The first time we've ever had someone with the title Sir on the Anchor.
So I'm never quite used to it. It's slightly embarrassing, really, when people use it. But knighthood is something that's awarded by the king. So the king knighted me. It just happened this July. It was announced in the New Year's Honours List at the beginning of 2025, and it's for services to education. So this is about my 10 years as a schools minister and my 27 years as a member of Parliament. So it's a great honour, and very proud to have received it. And I think it's an acknowledgement that standards have been rising in England's schools as a consequence of the reforms that I put in place and Michael Gove, the Education Secretary, put in place between 2010 and 2023. Well, you appear before the king and you kneel, and then he taps you on each shoulder with a real sword. And of course, it goes back to the knights. Yeah, the knights who used to defend the monarchy and fight for the monarchy. And so it's a long tradition. It goes back many centuries. Well, of course, the big famous public schools, as we call them here, private schools, they only teach about 7% of children. And so most people like me, we went to what you would call a public school, a state school. And I went to 7 different schools between 1965 and 1978 when I went to university. And all but one of those schools was public state. The rest one of them was a minor private school. I went to school between 1965 when, for those that know anything about British history, we had a Labour government that introduced very radical changes to our education system. And I saw the change happening as a kid. We also spent 2 years in Canada, where I was a child between the age of 7 and 9. So I've seen all kinds of schools, including some very academic schools I went to, and in the last couple of years of my school career, declining school where standards were very poor. I managed to get through it because I'd had the solid grounding in the earlier schools I'd been to. But it did give me an interest in education because I saw many of the things I later came to really understand happening in the later years of my school career, which I thought at the time, this is a bit odd. And I realized, having studied the subject in greater depth, that they were actually quite damaging to our education system. Yes. Yes, and to answer your earlier question, I did like school. I was an academic child and read, and some people call me bookish. I enjoyed the academic side. I wasn't saying I was very good at the sports side of the school, but certainly the academic side I did well. We did Latin. I did Latin for about 5 years at secondary school. I didn't do Greek, with some of the old famous boarding schools that you talk about do. But I just certainly did Latin and French and German and all the academic subjects, physics, chemistry, biology, geography, history, and so on. And I did well, both at 16 and at 18, and then went off to, I didn't get into Cambridge, sadly, but I went to Durham University and studied law. Yeah, so quite a traditional education, academic education. It was a gradual process. It started in 1964, 65 with Anthony Crossland, and he essentially abolished the split, which was quite unpopular in many ways, between the grammar schools and the secondary moderns. At that stage, you took a test, 11 plus, at age 11. If you passed, you went to a very academic school, a grammar school. If you didn't pass it, you went to a secondary modern, which was more general education. It was unpopular particularly with the middle classes, who were terrified of their child failing the 11 plus, and the secondary modern schools, they just weren't good enough, frankly. So they abolished that system slowly over the next several years. There are still 163 grammar schools left because a lot of the decisions were taken locally. But at the same time as that came some other unwelcome progressivist, if you like, educational ideologies that came in: mixed ability teaching, less focus on academic study, strange methods of teaching, learning by inquiry, project-based learning, and so on. All those things came in at the same time, and maybe we'll talk about those later, but those are the things I think that did quite a lot of damage from the mid-1960s onwards. And like most reforms, they take decades to either improve a system or damage a system. And the 1970s were a bad time for education in England, in Britain. Behaviour deteriorated. You had all these stories of quite violent classrooms because of a more relaxed approach to behaviour. And this kind of approach really embedded in the 80s as well. I wouldn't use that term because it has a meaning in Britain that it may not have in the States, which is it implies you studied Greek and you learnt all about all the Greek myths and the Roman mythology and all that. And I didn't have that kind of education, but I had a very traditional education. So we came out knowing things. You knew the geography of the world and you knew the history, quite a lot of history actually, of Britain and the world. We were taught that at least two languages, and we all were taught the three separate sciences: physics, chemistry, biology, whereas many children today learn just two, called a double award. So I would call it a more traditional education rather than a classical. But I suspect the nomenclature US versus UK, it probably does mean the same thing. Well, I'm skeptical of those kind of polls. I think that if you see England or Scotland or Wales, when those football teams from those countries are in the final or a semi-final or an important fixture against other countries of the world, you see the whole nation uniting behind the nation's team. I know that's not war, that's a sport. But if you look at the Falklands War, the most recent war that Britain fought, there was massive support for the Prime Minister and the country during that battle, and that was only as late as 1981. So I'm very skeptical. I think that people are proud of their country. I think they're not proud of some of our institutions. Politics has taken a real bash in terms of the esteem of politicians, and many of our great institutions have lost that standing. I think that's because of a growth of cynicism, both by the practitioners in those institutions, but also by the media as well, the way they just love gossip and they report bad things and rarely report good things. So I'm skeptical. I think the other thing I would say on that, though, is that I think you do need to know the history of your country, not in a jingoistic way. You just need to know it. And if you read about the history of Britain, there's some good bits. There's lots and lots of bad bits. But it should just be taught factually. There were bad kings, good administrations, bad administrations. I think children should be taught it. And if you have if you grow up and you don't understand why there's a market cross in your town, or why that particular road seems to go for miles and miles without bending. It's purely straight, and you don't realize that used to be a Roman road. I think it does detract from your understanding of your own country. So I think it is important to teach history as a knowledge-rich subject, so that you have a better understanding of why things are where they are and what they are. Well, the great thing happened in the early 2000s is that we had, or the late 90s, we had these international surveys done by TIMSS, the IEA, and by the OECD, PISA. And what was happening was that Britain was declining quite dramatically in these from when they started in 2000 to 2009. And that was a period when we were in opposition. We weren't in government. We were the shadow government, if you like, with our parliamentary system. And I was a shadow schools minister, and I saw us decline from 7th in reading to 25th. In that period, that 10-year period, I saw us decline from 8th to 28th in maths. Something very serious was going wrong. Very rapid, precipitous, and there's no reason why it would stop at 28th. This is the direction of travel. So I spent those 5 years every Monday visiting schools all over the country just to try and understand what was happening. I had my own instincts. I thought it was something to do with what I'd seen as a child in between 65 and 78 in terms of this sort of new methods of teaching that crept in the curriculum. But I needed to be sure. So I came across what's called the reading wars, about the whole language versus method of teaching reading versus phonics. But I knew there was something more than that, and I couldn't really define it. I knew it when I saw it. I knew that it was a low expectations. It was less focused on academic study. It was less rigorous in terms of behavior. There were strange methods of teaching that children were just left alone to kind of work things out for themselves. And then in 2006, I read a book by E.D. Hirsch, an American academic from Virginia University, called The Schools We Need and Why We Don't Have Them. And he explained everything. He explained everything I had already been thinking, but hadn't got the intellectual, a dead mass. Yep. And he did that. He provided me the language and the arguments as well. So that was absolutely revelatory. It was to education, as far as I'm concerned, what Friedrich von Hayek was to the economy and Milton Friedman was to monetarism. It was the key driver. And I made everybody read it back in England. I think, oh yes, absolutely know the name. Wonderful man. Yeah. And what Robert Pondiccio has done, he's taken the knowledge and applied it to the issue of reading comprehension. First of all, you have to teach children how to decode the words, and that's a kind of essential beginnings of reading. How do you turn these squiggles into words? You've got to get that sorted out early on, and that's what phonics is all about, and why whole language and 3 cueing is a disaster. You then have to get children to increase the speed of reading, and that's about practice. Then comprehension isn't about setting them multiple comprehension tests. It is about improving their knowledge. With knowledge comes vocabulary, and with vocabulary you can understand what you're reading, and the more you can understand what you're reading, the more you'll read. So he's absolutely right that you just need to improve children's comprehension of reading. You need to improve their knowledge. And then Hirsch also says that knowledge builds on knowledge, and it's not any knowledge. He says it's got to be the knowledge that enables you to contribute to society. You've got to know what the other people know, what the rich people, what the influential people know, and the more you know, the more you can know. So if in his book, he says, if you're trying to teach children that an electron orbits an atom in the same way that planets orbit the sun, well, If you don't know the planets orbit the sun, you're lost. That certainly doesn't help you. So he's absolutely right. Knowledge is crucial, and it helps close the attainment gap, because kids from advantaged families, educated families, they get all that lot of knowledge at home from going to traveling and talking about books and reading. The kids that don't come from that advantage, they come to school, with a deficit of knowledge, cultural capital, cultural literacy. And if you have a school that doesn't focus on knowledge, then the children with knowledge will get some knowledge, because it's like Velcro. But the kids that have no knowledge and they come to school and they don't focus on knowledge, they focus on these so-called skills, that gap widens between the two. So if you believe in social justice, you should want a knowledge-rich curriculum. And then the other book was Daniel Willingham, who I'm sure has been our guest on your podcast already. I hope so. If not, get him on. He wrote a book, Why Students Don't Like School, and he makes a really important point that if you want those higher order intellectual skills, critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, which we all want for our kids in a modern economy, if you want those skills, don't think you'll get them by just teaching them. Today's lesson is creativity. To be creative, you need to think outside the box. That will not make you creative or a critical thinker. What will make you a critical thinker is knowing stuff. All those higher order intellectual skills come from the knowledge. Why? Because the working memory, says Willingham and John Swallow in Australia, the working memory is very small. It only holds half a dozen pieces of information. So if I gave you 2 phone numbers and asked you to recite them back, you probably could. If I gave you 35 phone numbers right now and said, now recite them back, 0 chance you could do that. Why? Because the working memory can only hold half a dozen bits of new information. But where does that high level thinking take place? It takes place in the working memory. And you can't critically think about just 6 things. You can't just look up 7 sixes and the boiling point of water and the capital of France. You've got to know stuff to be able to critically think. So Willingham says that an education is about getting knowledge into the long-term memory of young people. And not just facts, but knowledge, concepts, understanding, procedures, all in your long-term memory. And that is a big difference. That understanding changed everything in England, because that was not the view of the education establishment or the view of most schools. So their view was, we live in a modern age. In fact, this whole idea goes back to the 1920s. It's not modern. They said you could look it up in an encyclopedia. And today they say you can look it up in Google. You can look it up in AI. You don't need to cram all this irrelevant knowledge into kids' brains. You could just teach them how to use AI and how to differentiate good knowledge and bad knowledge on Google. It's just nonsense, all that. If you want those higher order intellectual skills in our young people, knowledge is the key. So I've ranted on too long. So. Hmm. Hmm. Well, having read the book in 2006, I was then able to, in the final 3 years of opposition, just make sure that it was right. And then everything I continued to see in schools, even the language that people were using to describe what they were doing, all tallied in with E.D. Hirsch. So it was proof of concept of what he was saying I saw in our schools. So we tried to work out what to do about it. So we decided that reading was absolutely key, and we had to change the way reading was taught in our primary schools. We had to get teachers to use systematic phonics, systematic synthetic phonics in our schools. That was not the way it was taught in schools. It was all whole language. This multi-cueing, it was a 4-cueing thing in this country, not the 3-cueing you have in the States. But it was the same concept. You're getting kids to guess words based on the story context or the grammar context of the sentence they're reading. Absolute nonsense. So we had a study that was done in Scotland as well called the Clackmannanshire study, a 7-year longitudinal study of children that were taught using phonics. And it was showed dramatic improvements in these children's reading. So we decided we were going to insist on, so we changed the law, the national curriculum, to require primary school teachers to use synthetic phonics in the teaching of young children to read. We changed the teacher standards, so you couldn't qualify as a teacher unless you could do this. And we brought in a test called the Phonics Screening Check. This was a test for 6-year-olds. Very, very controversial, because you're testing 6-year-olds. Are you mad? There was a 1-to-1 test of the children reading to their own teacher one-on-one. 40 words, very simple words, but half of the words were made up words, they weren't real. And that was to make sure that the children were decoding, were using phonics, sounding it out, weren't just memorizing it. Again, that was controversial. You're teaching children words that don't exist. So what happened then? That became compulsory in 2012, and 58% of children passed. That was 32 correctly read words out of 40. And then every year after that, it went up and up and up. And by the time of COVID, it was 82%, and it dipped with COVID, and now it's back up to about 80% of passing that test. And because of that, if you go to any primary school now in England, you will see phonics in every single school. It's all, I mean, some do it better than others. Otherwise, it wouldn't be 82%. It would be 95% or 100%. There are many hundreds of schools, by the way, that do get 100%. And as a consequence of that change in the way reading is taught, we've now gone from 16th in pearls in reading, we've gone up to 4th in the world in reading, behind only Hong Kong, Singapore, and Russia. So we did that. And that was an early thing. We also changed the national curriculum. We got rid of it. We had a competence-based, skills-based curriculum. We got rid of that, and we replaced it with a knowledge-rich curriculum. We had a panel of people to produce knowledge-rich curriculum. We changed our exams at 16 and 18, so they were more knowledge-focused. So those are the main changes we made. And also we did a lot of work on maths. We looked at the top of PISA and said, look, we're 27th, but who's at the top? Singapore, South Korea, Japan, Shanghai, and we had a look at what they did. So we took the Singapore curriculum, and we made that our primary school curriculum, and we brought in a test for 9-year-olds, like the phonics check, but this was a multiplication tables check. It was a computer-based test. They had 6 seconds to answer 25 multiplication tables questions, and now kids in our primary schools, they know their tables. They really do. They didn't used to when I used to quiz them when I was visiting school. They absolutely know them now. And we've gone from 27th in maths in PISA in England, not the UK, England, 27th to 11th in 2022, the most recent PISA. And that's, again, because of our reforms. And there are opportunities, undoubtedly, particularly in helping teachers. It can do all kinds of tasks that teachers had to do that were time-consuming and tedious. Report writing and marking and all kinds of things they could do. They can even create curriculum materials if it's carefully protocoled to make sure that it's looking at the right things. There is a danger with AI, and the danger is that you ask a pupil to write an essay, and they just click a few things into the computer and out pops an essay, and they think that's done. Well, it may well be done, and you may well get away with convincing the teacher you didn't just do that, but you won't have learnt anything. The purpose of getting a school student to write an essay isn't because the teacher wants the essay that they're going to sell or something. The purpose of you writing the essay is for you to learn how to read a history book, or to look up, to research the thing in science, whatever it is, and then to learn how to write and to précis. All these, that's why you do the essays. So it worries me that there is this notion that somehow you should almost encourage children to do this, but they have to cite the fact they've done it. It's just, that worries me. And we could end up with children just not developing those intellectual skills that we want. But they're certainly going to save a lot of teachers' time. And that's time that they can spend with the children, making sure they understand the concepts that they're teaching, and getting rid of misconceptions and helping them to practice and so on. Well, I have to say, I mentioned the E.D. Hirsch book. I mean, that had such a profound impact on my understanding of the education system that we were trying to deal with in England, in the UK. And as a consequence, it's had a big impact on me personally. It meant that the reforms we introduced were successful because they were based on solid intellectual grounding. In terms of some of my favorite books to read for pleasure, I mean, for me, the American novel is East of Eden, John Steinbeck. It's American. I love American literature, by the way. I mean, it's in two halves, the book. So there's the first half that's set on the East Coast. It's the West Coast second half that I love. I love it because it is written at a time when the West Coast was almost developing, if you like, so far as non-indigenous people in America, and and it's written not as a historical book, but when you read it now and you look back, you can feel the atmosphere of California in the early days of its development, and that for me is very exciting. And I'm trying to read all the American Pulitzer Prize winners for fiction from 1919 onwards. And what's wonderful, particularly about the early ones, is again they were written as contemporary novels. They were never intended to be historical. But when I read The Magnificent Ambersons, this is written in I think 1920. You read it as though it's a historical novel, but actually it was written as a contemporary novel, and it's just wonderful. I love that, and that's what I love about East of Eden. It's just the atmosphere of early California that comes through is spectacular. Super. Thank you for having me, Jeremy. It's been great fun. Thank you.